Let's take a moment and begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your guidance to the people seeking a cure for the pandemic, and we ask your particular blessing on victims and their families and those who are suffering under it today. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Amen. Okay. We're still going on sort of the spread of humanism. Near the end of the 15th century, a Christian scholar and humanist called Maximus the Greek came into Russia. And after studies in Italy and Greece, he sought to reform the liturgy in Russia and bring about a reform in the monastic life. One of the interesting things about the Russian church, and I shouldn't say this of the Russian church. In fact, maybe I'll just put it at the end of this when we finish. So he attacked the clergy because they cowardly were obedient to civil authorities. And civil law was more important to the church than was the church itself. He wanted a very poor but spiritually independent church so that it would speak out publicly against bad rulers and be a loud voice for justice and Christian values. The thing that's interesting, and I don't think many Catholics think in these terms, but one of the great benefits of the Roman Catholic Church is we are an international church. And as a result of that, while the American government has a lot of authority over the church in the United States, they could close our buildings. I mean, we're really basically at their mercy. The Catholic Church is not at their mercy because we have churches everywhere else in the world. And that's true of everything. That's why the Catholic Church was one of the strongest voices against the Nazis. And unlike the Lutheran Confessing Church in Germany, we had a basis outside Germany where we could speak, and they didn't. Well, the same thing's true of the Russian Orthodox Church. There are very few real Russian Orthodox foundations outside of the Soviet Union itself. And as a result of that, they're very bound to a kind of control by the government, and there's really not much you can do about that. You think about it, the early church, of course, we were founded under the Roman Empire, and they were in control of everything. But after 400 years, that changed. And since then, we've always been under more than one government simultaneously. And so we have this ability to somehow protect ourselves. But something to be aware of, that I think people are too harsh oftentimes in judging a church for silence, without realizing that the church in these different countries, particularly churches that are confined to one country, are really under the control of that government. That's one of the historical issues of Russia today. In fact, when I was studying in the seminary in our novitiate in Rhinebeck, New York, there is a foundation in New York, a Russian Orthodox monastery. I think it's called the Monastery of the Holy Cross. And it's Russian Orthodox, but true to Orthodox tradition, they speak the local language. So they speak English at this monastery. It's a very large monastery, very active, and all this sort of thing. But they do not recognize the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia because of the influence the government has had over the appointing of bishops and the head bishop of the church, the patriarch, and all this. So that they completely, put it off. It would be like a parish like Old Mission San Luis Obispo would suddenly think that we are the only Catholics in the entire world and reject the fact of Catholics anywhere else in the whole world, period. For us, it sounds absolutely ridiculous. But that's the way they maintain their independence. And they've held it even, since the liberation of Russia itself. Anyway, this is a result of the humanism that he had studied, and the importance of a human being and this sort of thing, and the importance of liturgy. For instance, in humanism, when you talk liturgy, it's the importance of the liturgy actually speaking to the people rather than necessarily preserving the form it had in the past. That's how humanism affects liturgy. This humanism, which emphasizes the creativity and the thought of the individual person, at this time in the West, took the form of a love for classical Greek and Roman culture. And when we say a love of that, I want you to understand we mean particularly a love of the architecture. And when you study architecture, you notice periodically we go through sections where we all go back to Greece and Rome. We think in terms of columns, arches, and this sort of thing. That's always kind of going back to this Greek and Roman architecture. And periodically, it just happens in the field of architecture. However, they were strong believers, although there was a slight anti-Christian strain in this movement. The anti-Christian strain, of course, is because if you study historically, a lot of the monuments that the Roman Empire built up and the Greek country were destroyed by the early church as being centers of paganism. So that's, anytime you see a rise in this, there's a slight judgment of the church, although the people here were pretty strong believers. And they thought to bring new life to the church from the great leaders of the ancient world. Again, when you go through these movements, they tend to look back romantically. Now, in our tradition, they look back romantically at St. Augustine and St. Jerome and Athanasius and these great leaders. And they sort of long for those days and look to how we could return to that. Some humanists at that time began to look at the primitive church as the model for reform, that we should reform and be like the primitive church. But to be honest, the primitive church was the way it was because it was against the law. Like, they didn't build great buildings. It's because they weren't allowed to. The day they were allowed to, they did. They never worshiped openly. They always worshiped in secret. And that's because they didn't want to be turned into the government. They also never accepted, like if someone wanted to become a Catholic, you had to go through quite a process before you ever attended a service, because we didn't want someone in who might be a spy from the Roman government. So the church was formed in a very set way at that time. I think one of the things that is really true, and you notice that when you get older, I think young people don't quite realize this, but when I look at people in the United States now, they speak of romantically of the 1950s. In the 1950s, everyone seemed to respect everyone. The economy was doing rather well. I go through a whole list of things with regards to the 1950s, and people look back at that time kind of romantically. Now, those of us who lived through the 1950s can't do that. I think it's certainly a better time in the country than we have now. But if you talk about racism, racism was unbelievably strong. I remember my sister and I traveled from San Diego to New York, in New York City, to be sponsors of a cousin of mine at her baptism. And my sister and I traveled by bus, and it was perfectly safe. No one saw anything about it at the time. But what we did was go across the country, basically parallel to the Gulf of Mexico, and then go up the East Coast, because we thought it would be the most interesting way to take the trip. And it didn't cost anything more or less that way. So we went across the country. And my sister and I were always getting in trouble in the South, because we would drink out of a drinking fountain that said blacks only. Or you go in a restaurant and be only one booth open, and that booth was just for blacks. And I mean, this sort of stuff, we forget how strong that sort of stuff was at the time. But it's very common for people to look back at a period of time and look at it romantically and to try and duplicate it. I'm sure you're familiar with the speech that is given over Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. But one of the things that he says is that the evil that people do is buried with them, and that the good they do remains. And that's true of ages too. We tend to look back at ages at the good things about them, one way or another, and tend sort of overlook how bad they were. That's something I think you know that's going on in Europe right now, where they're looking back at fascist socialism and seeing how strong and united Germany and everything was under it, as was Spain. And they're looking at romantically, but that was not a good time. Anyway, Lorenzo Valla was a scholarly researcher serving Pope Nicholas V. And he worked in the Vatican, and again, this man is a very scholarly man, and he proved that some of the documents used by the Pope to claim territorial rights in Italy were forgeries. One of them was the so-called Donation of Constantine, and it basically decreed that a lot of lands in Italy Constantine took out of the empire and gave to the Pope. There were a couple lands outside Italy too, and that was the basis on which, like France was formed, something like Avignon remained under the Pope rather than, it's all from this document. And he proved that the document was simply a forgery, that there was no basis for any of that. He also questioned whether the Apostles' Creed had anything to do with the apostles at all. And today, we don't think the Apostles' Creed came out of that period of time at all. It's certainly the beliefs they held at the time, but to attribute this to one of the apostles or something is not true. And the reason why he's important, he's the beginning of what's called textual criticism. We used to, when we got an old document, and this scripturally too, we got an old document, we would look at the document and we would try and understand what the document was saying and stuff. But there was not too much look is this document authentic? You know, probably the best example of this is to move away from the Catholic Church and move into the Mormon community. In the Mormon community, probably about 10, 20 years ago, some documents began to be found, and they talked about Joseph Smith seeing a huge salamander and just really bizarre things. And these documents were being found and discovered, and the Mormon community was getting them and was beginning to analyze what it was saying about Joseph Smith. And they were doing it. But simultaneously, in the Mormon community, there were people working on textual criticism. I'll give you some examples of textual criticism. You first of all look at the paper that's being used. Does that paper date from the day the document is supposed to have been written? Or does it date from later, it's been artificially aged? And then you look at the ink. Was the ink they used available? And you can study the type of liquid that was used to hold the ink together. See, the ink is largely black soot out of chimneys, that sort of thing. And so the binding thing, sometimes the binding thing that is used for ink is different in different places of the world. So if a document purports to come from Greece and it's really held together, let's say with sap off some tree that exists in Lebanon, the chances are the document came from Lebanon because that's what they used to use for their ink. In Greece, they used olive oil. But anyway, so they began to analyze the thing itself. And the Mormons found out that all those documents that said the crazy things about Joseph Smith were just that. They were crazy things. A man in, I think he was in Salt Lake City, was actually creating these documents. He was artificially aging them You soak them in things like vinegar and then dry them in an oven. They get crisp like an old paper. It's a very easy process to go through. And the reason he was doing it, he couldn't care less about the Mormons or Joseph Smith or anything. The Mormons need and like to have documents from Joseph Smith in their possession. So they would pay good money for these ancient documents the man purported to find. Okay? But that's textual criticism. You look at it in order to find out, is it in fact authentic? Now, this document about Constantine leaving all the land to the church, the document was very, very old, but not quite as old as Constantine. And the elements used in it were not available at the time of Constantine. So anyway, he brought that. That's become a huge tool in the study of Scripture. And I think you know the value of ancient scriptural manuscripts is so astronomical that there is good reason to try and fake them. And so people do it all the time. It's very difficult to get by the experts today with that, but they still try it. In 1400, as Europe began to change, two cities became centers of reform and thinking, two powerful cities. One was Flanders, and I think you know in Holland, the cities had a tremendous amount of independence. We talked about that earlier. And the big things that were going on in Flanders were, first of all, banking and commerce. I'm not sure the reason why Holland became so much a center of trade from different areas, but they did. I think part of it is they tended to be very accepting of all different nationalities and stuff like that. But there was a period of time when Holland was in fact the richest country in the entire world. And they were also very rich in cultural activities and paintings and stuff like that. And the reason was, if you have a lot of money, you begin to put it into art and stuff like that. So that they're great painters. They're still huge collectors of great art in Flanders. The other place, of course, was Florence, and that's because of the Medicis. We talked about them earlier. And this was an outstanding pioneer in the accumulation of wealth and the production of new cultural trends. You know, today, if you are a playwright, if you write plays, the place to do it is in New York. If your play can make it in New York, you're a playwright. And that will make you if it makes it in New York. If it makes it in other cities, that's good. But I think you know that if a play is really good in other cities, they will move it to New York. And that's the city to do that. New York is also the place for art. I think if you travel around the world, you will notice that if you go into and almost any of the coastal cities in California, you see an immense number of paintings of the ocean, which people do. If you go into Paris, you see an immense number of paintings of downtown scenes in Paris. There's all these things in different places, and they're all over the world. But if a painter becomes really good, you'll watch them move to New York. And if they don't move to New York, their art will be sold through galleries in New York. If you make it in New York, you're an artist. That's the way it is. Well, as a result of that, these cities like New York have great cultural wealth. All kinds of art is there, and all these musicals and things like that, plays. That's very much, well, that was what was going on at this time. The city had a republican form of government, but the rich merchants had taken control of the city, and finally the Medici family were in charge. The Medici family were rich merchants. A republican form of government is that we get together and we elect leaders who speak for us. They're in charge for a certain length of time. In a democracy, the leaders will suggest things, but for something to happen, there has to be a general vote on it. okay? But if what you vote on are leaders who take care of doing it, and the United States is essentially a Republican form of government, okay? We call ourselves a democracy because we elect the people who go in. But in a Republican setup, it is possible to take control of it. And one of the reasons why it's possible to take control of it is we could have a person come up and masquerade about what they're interested in, and they would be for things that you and I are very interested in, so we elect them to the government. But once they're in the government, they don't have to ask us anymore. And they can be a very, very different person. In the United States, that usually doesn't happen because the person who goes in wants to be reelected anyway. So that's not the big issue. But that's one of the dangers of a Republican form of government. And that's went on in Florence. The Republican form of government was used to gradually give the things of government to a small group of very wealthy people. And the head of those was the Medicis. And so they had come under that. For 60 years, they would determine the entire destiny of Florence. And if you speak from the area of art, like I'm very interested in art, but if you speak from the area of the art, you say, thank God they were in charge for 60 years. And you go there, you see Michelangelo, you see Raphael, you see all the great artists. In fact, there's a gallery in Florence called the Uffizi. And if you go into the Uffizi and go through the gallery, one of the things you notice is if you could take all the paintings out and put them in two stacks, one stack where there would be 75% of all the paintings are Christmas cards you've seen. They're Madonnas and child, and I don't know whether they gave the rights to reproduce them early or something like that, or they have lower rates than other museums. But when I was going through the gallery with a friend of mine, I told him it's like opening Christmas cards, but they're all the paintings. And it just shows you how much art, how much wonderful art is centered in Florence even today. But the Medicis had actually come from the countryside in the 1200s and gradually became very rich merchants and bankers, underlined bankers. They were loaning money at high rates, and that's where they really got it. The two most important figures in the family were Cosimo and Lorenzo the Magnificent. And again, when you go through Florence, if you go through with a good guide, almost any building of any importance you see will either be Cosimo or Lorenzo the Magnificent. They're the ones who did it. Incidentally, the correct pronunciation is Cosimo, not Cosmo, but it's Cosimo. The fame of Florence at this time is due much more to the artistic and cultural life of the city. Byzantine Greeks got a taste of Florence when the council to unite the Western and Eastern churches was held there. And with the fall of Constantinople, many of the most important manuscripts of Constantinople were taken to the city of Florence. And if you look at architecture and paintings, and by architecture I mean whole pieces of buildings, that went to Venice. And you can see that in Venice itself. But the manuscripts, the people who are interested in manuscripts, the study of scripture and the ancient Greek authors and stuff like that, much of that was held in Constantinople because when the Eastern Empire was there, it included Greece. And as the Muslims were taking over these different areas, things they thought really valuable were all moved little by little into Constantinople, so it was all there. And many of the people who escaped brought these manuscripts with them. The Medici family financed the purchase of a remarkable number of these, the manuscripts. And I think you know the greatest artists that history knows today almost all served in Florence and come from around that time. The humanistic society created by the money and the genius of the Medici created one of the greatest cultural centers that the world has ever seen. I can never visit Florence personally without thinking about what the great centers of wealth today will leave behind. Like they had huge wealth there, and when it was finished, the city of Florence would stand forever, or up to our own day anyway, as a cultural masterpiece. And you wonder what happens with the wealth that's accumulated. I've never done much of a study on it, but I do know this is one of the things that Prince Charles in England writes about with great frequency, that England's a very wealthy country. And he doesn't like the architecture, he doesn't like the things that are left, and he's very much into the very old architecture. But you can't help but wonder, is it going to stand as significant, or is there time with, what do you want to call it, with great wealth actually being wasted? We're going to 1450 now. The Chinese were using block printing by the end of the 6th century, okay? I remember when I first went to China, as part of a preparation, I got a book called, I think it's The Cultural Flowering of China, something like that. But it's a book by a gentleman, a German, and a research book on things. It's basically things that started in China. And it's amazing, like when I think of this block type, I always think of Gutenberg and the Bible. But actually, this was invented 200 years earlier in China. And it would be hundreds of years before this reached the West. It was a very labor-intensive process. What they used to do was take a square the size of a page, and they would carve the text on that. And then you had to do a deep carving, so the letters were up and the wood was down. And you painted it with ink, and then you put paper on and put a roller across it and peeled it off. And then you had to put ink on. If you ever put too much ink, it all got blotchy on the thing, and too little, it didn't print. So you had to have the right amount of ink, and that had to be done before each page. That was still much faster than someone writing a manuscript by hand. It was a real improvement over that. The typed page was carved on a block of wood, printed with ink, and then the wood pressed wood paper pressed against the wood. The Chinese went on also to invent movable-type around 1450 rather. A German printer, Gutenberg, made movable type out of metal. So the thing that the Chinese did was, once they did these great blocks, then they learned to cut the blocks into pieces, so you didn't ever have to carve a page anymore, that you put together the letters according to the way you wanted. The specific thing that Gutenberg added was these were made out of metal. Now, the big thing is that when you use wood, over a period of time, you wear the wood down, but also, I think you know when wood is wet, it oftentimes begins to fiber, come apart, and that would happen because the ink is wet. So they would put the ink on, and over a period of time, the letters would become kind of foggy, and so they had to get rid of them. Movable type, you could move out the foggy letter and go on. So the movable type was a great thing. And when they went to metal, that was fantastic. After one page was printed, it was possible to remove, sort, and reuse the letters. Printing became much less expensive, and many more copies of books were being printed. Books before this time were treasures. Like if you owned a book, it was priceless. They had been written entirely by hand. Incidentally, the last illuminated manuscript written by hand was actually written in the United States, and it is in St. John's College back east. They commissioned someone to do it with the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and so it's the newest piece of that, and pages are beautifully illuminated. In fact, you can buy as posters or as wall hangings or anything, almost any individual page in that Bible. It's gorgeous work. Within 50 years, there were printing presses in more than 100 European cities. Okay? Now, one of the advantages of the printing press is the ability to disseminate literature all over. Like if I want to speak, I have to speak in certain areas. And where I speak, then they make the ideas known. Another advantage of speaking to the speaker, but not to the audience, is that I can say one thing here and something else in Santa Barbara. And oftentimes politicians would do that at one time. Once printing comes out, a printed page, because of the way the printing takes place, when you read it in San Luis Obispo, it's going to be the same thing in Santa Barbara. And it was a way of disseminating ideas far beyond the speaker, that the ideas could be disseminated all over. In the 15th century alone, more than 13,000 editions and 4 million volumes were printed. I would suspect that that's probably pretty close to what's going on today, because the printing of books is disappearing. We're going down. People do books online and stuff like that. So the impact of the printed book on European life was gradual, but actually it was revolutionary. And I would say there are two things that are going to come on later in history that depend unbelievably on the printing press. And the first is going to be the Reformation, where the teachings of Luther and everything could be disseminated throughout the whole world. And the second thing was the American Revolution. The American Revolution was highly dependent. There's several of the early revolutionaries who are famous basically as printers, used to put this stuff out. There were new and valuable editions of the Bible, classic works, and the current authors of the day. However, most were reprinting favorites from the Middle Ages, fiction, romantic novels, school texts, and sermon collections. Before the printing press, it would never occur to you to just kind of to write a novel, because you'd have to sell the one volume and have to find someone very wealthy to get a hold of it and stuff like that. So you really, really didn't do that. Once the printing press began, so they just had to print all this other stuff, that's all they had to print. But once the printing press came into being, then there was a reason for someone actually to sit down and compose a novel, because then it could be reproduced to thousands and go out. And so that began happening, but it would take a little while for them to realize what the thing could actually do. The growth of the universities at this time also simultaneously created more people with the ability to read, and the availability of books created the need for places of education. So the books and the universities all worked together as they went through this. Even if one just needed to know how to read, it all came together at once. Books were the way to get new ideas into public, and writing was replacing oratory. So before this, I told you that to be a powerful leader, you really had to be a powerful speaker. Well, beginning at this point, to be a powerful leader, you needed to be a powerful writer. One of the differences between being a powerful speaker and a powerful writer is that as a powerful writer, you can always hire someone who can actually present your ideas in a better way. So we have many people around this time who will be very wealthy and important people who will become famous for their ideas and things, but they usually have hired someone who's better at writing who puts it down. Now, speakers can't do that. If someone else gets up in front of the group and gives your talk, I don't know if many of you remember this, but in doing this, I can't help but remember. Andy Warhol was a man who had a terrible, terrible fear of crowds. He had a lot of psychological difficulties about a lot of things. A lot of artists do. But anyway, whenever they would have an interview with him, there would always be the question of whether it was really him. He had a couple of lookalikes, and the first time it was really noticed, and I don't know how this really happened, but he was giving, what do you want to call it? He was giving interviews simultaneously in 3 places. That's when they knew. So then they began to look, and but you could pull that off. So also, to be successful at printing, one had to print what people wanted to buy. And so at this time it meant, first of all, the surviving writings, the surviving good writings of the Middle Ages. Remember we talked about Ignatius of Loyola, how he had this great love of novels and these old novels about knights and ladies, that sort of thing. Well, people liked that stuff, so that became part of the fodder for printing at the beginning. The arts in Europe entered a time of heightened creativity in this period. Great changes in sculpture, painting, and architecture were happening, and this is most particularly true in the city of Florence. There was a new understanding of anatomy, geometry, mathematics, and pervading everything was a Christian view of life. So we had a Christian view of life. I'd like you to see how humanism affects this. If we were to sit down, any one of us were to decide, let's say we're going to do a painting of the founding of Mission San Luis Obispo, however you would envision it. I think most of us could do a painting of the foundation of Mission San Luis Obispo. However, as soon as humanism comes in, the thing that's important to humanism is the human being. And so while you might look at this and say, I can see this is a picture of the founding of Mission San Luis Obispo, but there's something wrong with these people. Well, with humanism, you don't do that. And the second thing that came up this time was portraits. If you look before this time, a lot of painting is done, but not a lot of portraits. Because again, most people could do a painting, but you have to have a great thing of anatomy for portraiture. And people like Leonardo da Vinci, in fact, even put out books of the study of human anatomy. And when you, one of the ways of doing a painting is to take, let's say, a hand. You take a hand, and what you do, first of all, is draw the bone structure. And you realize why the bones are wider here than they are here, because the joints there. So you draw the bones, and then when you learn where the muscles are, then you draw the muscles in, and then you draw the whole thing. And it helped people, and most of these artists at this time, the Middle Ages and stuff, would dissect bodies and study where the muscles were and where these things were. Because when you look at let's say you look at a human body, a person standing there, really you're looking at a covering, because the skin is covering things. And if you don't know what it's covering, you can't really put it together. Well, humanism brought that to art, and it had a Christian point of view. The humanist Renaissance artists placed the human being at the very center of everything. And of course, that's the meaning of humanism. They portrayed the human body with a realism that was not known before. In fact, it was, it caused a lot of problems because a humanist, because of the exactitude of the human body, I'll use Michelangelo as an example. Before Michelangelo, they used to have great paintings of, let's say, the Last Judgment, which Michelangelo put in the Sistine Chapel. In paintings of the Last Judgment, they oftentimes showed the saints clothed in different ways. People in hell were always shown nude, okay? But again, because people didn't have as much interest in anatomy and stuff, that they are, you can tell they're people, you can tell they're nude, but that's all. Once humanism came in, when they painted nudes, nudes were interesting and alluring. And this began to bother people. So many of you may know that when the Sistine Chapel was painted by Michelangelo, it was a theme that you'd see 1,000 times before. However, there was a specific cardinal who really, really objected to it. And eventually, I think they called the cardinal the pantaloon, which basically meant shorts. And so what he did, they painted, wisps of cloth and this sort of thing on the nude figures. If you go to the Sistine Chapel today, incidentally, they've removed all of that from the paintings on the walls and the ceiling. They have not removed it from the Last Judgment, largely because the Last Judgment is such a classical thing in people's minds. So many people have seen it, so they decide not to do that. But in the other paintings, they've kind of removed it. So the human body began to be just very, very realistic. They did not just look at models, but they studied the structure of bones and muscles. The magnificent buildings for which this period is famous were very often inspired by the human body. And some interesting things, if you go into, go into the study of, look at architecture, for instance, very often the way windows are arranged, they would oftentimes be arranged in pairs, like eyes. The whole building would be arranged in pairs. Arches, in some cases, would imitate the human stance, so that you had arches like this, you had arches that came like this, but they oftentimes picked parts of the human body. And if you see it, it's very pleasing to you, but you don't recognize it as a part of the human body if you haven't studied it. But psychologically, the reason it appeals to you is because it's part of the human body. And architecture can become very seductive in that way. There was a mathematical structure to painting with a clear center and everything balanced to focus on the center and not to compete with it. One of the interesting things when you study painting, you want people, when their eyes go to a painting, you want it to move around the painting to the center so that they've seen the painting, but they concentrate on what you want them to look at. And it is possible to do a huge painting, a very large painting. A man who was great at this was the artist David in France. You do a very large painting, and there could be one person in the crowd he really wants you to look at. And you can structure the painting so when everything's finished, they're looking at that one person in the crowd by the lighting that's on the person and all different kinds of things. And so they used to do this, and there were very strict rules. Modern artists have moved away from the rules, but they found other ways to do the same thing. But initially there were rules, and the arm was so long in proportion to the head, and the head, the human body, I think there's 2 heads between the shoulders and the waist, and 3 heads between the waist and the floor, and they go these dimensions. Da Vinci did a huge book on that sort of stuff. They understood that as a person walked away from you, they became smaller and smaller. And that may sound so simple to us, but again, if you go through paintings before this time, you find out that all the people are about the same size in the whole thing. They didn't know how to do what we call perspective. And so perspective was done this way. When I was studying painting, perspective was a very mathematical thing. We picked the end, the horizon line, then everything had to go back to that. Usually picked a point in the painting, and everything had to go in line to that. You could put up buildings, everything, and it caused you to move. But older paintings are not like that. Incidentally, there's a specific name for that art today that doesn't use good perspective, and it's called primitive. And there's some great artists, like one who was several years ago anyway, was a woman in the United States called Grandma Moses, and she did all kinds of farm scenes, no perspective at all. Beautiful art, but it's called American primitive. The subject matter was almost always Christian: saints, biblical scenes, and portraits. Okay? In 1490, the flowering of knowledge and information afforded by the humanistic direction of the Renaissance brought forward many individuals who would greatly influence the church in this period of reform that would follow in the Reformation. And we're going to go through a listing of a number of people. There may be names you've heard of, maybe names you didn't know at all. But one of the things to understand, we've talked about this a little bit, there was a huge need of reform in the church at this time. And individuals recognized it and had their own way of going about reform. And so we're going to look at them. There was a man called Nicholas of Causa. He was a humanist of German origin, and he had a great interest in a wide variety of subjects. That's usually true of humanists at this time. They are like we call Renaissance men. They're interested in many, many different things. And he was a mystical thinker who constantly stressed the limitations of human knowledge. One of the things that I think is really curious is that as a person grows in knowledge, the more you know is unknown. And you grow in this. And I always like to use the example that if you're in grade school taking your very first class in some kind of physics, you have questions for a teacher. And when you finish your PhD in physics, you know 1,000 times more maybe than the person who taught you in your first class of physics, but you also have 10,000 questions they never thought of. You end up with more questions. So one of the things is people who are bright and have great knowledge end up with a better understanding of how far the spiritual and everything moves beyond our knowledge. Now, as knowledge grows, we'll get to know more about this stuff all the time. But I would say if we were to go back maybe 150 years, a lot of what we call psychology today, they called mysticism. They didn't know anything about it. Now, we're able to experiment with it and know a lot about those things. But anyway, this was a man who constantly stressed the limitations of human knowledge. And that's because as the humanists got going, they began to think you could know everything. That's why I think you know that the word sophomore means wise fool. And the idea is that when you start out education as a freshman, you get started. But about the time you're a sophomore, you begin to know a lot. And you get the impression that you can know everything, and you do know a lot. And you're wrong on both counts. As a priest, he sought to reform the clergy. So his point of reform actually was the clergy. One of the points on which he preached was the selling of indulgences, which will become a big thing under Luther, which was causing people to believe that you could buy salvation. Now, I'll give you an example. The church could give, let's say, an indulgence, let's say 1,000-year indulgence if you make a donation to the missions, okay? So everyone who makes a donation to the missions gets a 1,000-year indulgence. That's good, that's fine, that works well. However, the temptation is to say that everyone who donates under $50 gets a 1,000-year indulgence, and anyone who does over 10,000 will get a 5,000-day indulgence. Well, once you do that, you realize you've equated salvation with the finances, okay? Like today, if there's an indulgence for making a donation, let's say there's an indulgence for making a donation to the mission. If that's true, you would earn the indulgence if, in fact, you help take the collection. You would earn the indulgence by doing 1,000 things that wouldn't involve money. And if you gave $1 million or 2 cents in the money thing, you'd get the same amount. Now that's the proper working of an indulgence, but it very quickly slipped into this idea that you could buy salvation. He worked with Pius II in the reformation of the clergy in Rome. Now remember, the Pope, while he is Pope of the entire church, he in fact is Bishop of Rome. And any Pope who was seriously interested in reforming the church always first reformed the clergy in the city of Rome. And they were subject to many, many reformations. But you'll watch historically that a lot of people who are big on the reformation of people popes will never start with Rome at all. And that's a sign they aren't interested in reformation. If they're interested in reformation, they try and restore the city of Rome. In fact, there used to be a saying, if you could reform the Roman clergy, you could create heaven on earth. Okay? It's always difficult. So he believed that the encounter with the Lord could take place only through intuition. And intuition is insights that come without reasoning. So now remember, one of the things that he's very interested in is that there's very important things outside of knowledge. And I'll give you an example of this, that you could study the Roman Catholic teaching on the Eucharist. It says that the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Jesus Christ himself. There are rules on what you have to do in order to have bread. There are rules on what you have to do in order to have wine. There are prayers that need to be said. There's a huge study about the Eucharist. You could go through that, and you could have a great, great knowledge of the Eucharist. On the other hand, if you're a Catholic, I would encourage you to think back to the day of your first communion and how it impacted you when you received it. Well, that was intuition. When you received the Eucharist, the way you felt, the way it hit you, that's intuition. And he's saying, and I think we would all agree with this, that the experience of the presence of God is not found in learning and facts and everything. That can certainly prepare you for it, but that's not where it's found. It is found ultimately in this experience of God that comes through intuition. Thomas Aquinas, the great story of Thomas Aquinas was on his deathbed, he appealed to the people who were taking care of him to burn all of his works. And the idea was he'd come to an intuition knowledge of the God about whom he'd done all these things, and all these things just seemed unimportant to him in the light of his intuition. But the fact of the matter is, it's all that learning that prepared him for that intuition. And then he came to this powerful understanding of God. Okay, why don't we call it there? And we'll pick it up and move on into the Reformation probably next week.